Thanks for coming and checking out my analysis of the Burnley game. If this is your first time checking out one of my videos, thanks for checking me out. And please, if you like, click on the thumbs up, subscribe, and share. Okay, so there was one really big tactical change in this game. And that was that Arsenal decided, or Arteta decided, they are not going to cross the ball into the box for obvious reasons. Burnley are a big side, and they're very aggressive in the air. So getting the ball or giving the ball to players in wide areas would only slow down attacks because they're not going to put the ball into the box frequently. And there's numerous examples here that you can see where we've got the ball in a central area. It's very compact through the middle. And instead of kicking the ball wide, we try to play the ball through the middle. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. The only times that we did try to cross was when we could get a wide player in behind their defense in a more narrow position. And so I think the best example of this was Kieran Tierney making a late run and Odegaard clipping the ball over the top, where he was able to take a first touch across the defender and then basically driving towards that near post for a cross. So the game plan clearly was to not go into the wide players, which is why they were much more narrow, but to try and find the people in the half spaces. And what we had was those wide players came into the half spaces a little bit more too, or closer to the half spaces too, to see if they could kind of occupy the fullback and try to give that 10 player, that creative player in the half spaces, a little bit more time on the ball by occupying that defender. The problem I think that we had, the 4-3-3 formation. Now, if you're not aware, Arteta is implementing a Juego de Posicion or positional play kind of system. And that is more modernly based on a 20 zone field that Guardiola is famous for. In this system, basically, you have vertical lines and horizontal lines, or vertical zones and horizontal zones. The vertical zones, you can have no more than 2 people to a zone. And across the horizontal zones, you can have no more than 3 people in a zone. And so there's, examples of this where you might have your left-sided wide player, your right-sided wide player, and your center forward might be in one horizontal zone, with the 2 players that are playing in the half spaces slightly withdrawn to make that classic W shape. The reason for this is to create angles to separate the defensive line. And the idea is that the players that are playing in these spaces, in these lines, are to try and get into areas in between players to make it difficult for them to know who they're marking. So, for example, if you have the player in your right half space is in between the opponent's defensive and midfield lines, then the question becomes, is it the left back that marks that player? Is it the centre back that marks that player, or is it the defensive midfielder that marks that player? And that confusion can open up space. The 4-3-3 that Arsenal used was very narrow. And the problem that it caused was that there was a huge overload through the middle of the field and not much room. But then it also meant that Burnley were able to set themselves up in such a way where they could cut off lines of pass into the players that we wanted to get on the ball. A great example of this was Saka. Saka found it very difficult to get on the ball in the half spaces. While we tried, it didn't quite materialize. Whenever it did, it caused, we were able to cause some problems. And actually, the goal itself, the free kick, Saka was able to receive a ball in the half space on the back on the back foot on the half turn and get driving at the defense, which is what led to that problem. It was one of a few occasions where a player in a half space behind their midfield was able to get onto the ball. I think the main difficulty here was because of the shape of the midfield, the three-man centre midfield. For example, Odegaard on the left was often in a straight line because he was in that vertical zone with Saka. And so, whenever there's that straight line, that straight vertical line, it's really easy to cut passes out. You're basically just looking to have a player play in as a screen, and you're not able to find that player. So that is what kind of tended to happen quite often. A lot of the times as well, and this is where the difficulties that Arsenal had came from, is a lot of the times they actually had more players in a line than they should have. So, for example, there were times where they had 3 people in the left channel, where you're only supposed to have 2, based on the principles of the JDP. And so basically that always left a defender free, not occupied, which made it easier for them to have some defensive structure and some defensive solidity. And this basically is, you can see that the principles are there, that they're trying to play to the JDP system, but the understanding is coming. It's not quite there, and I think this is part of why the attack isn't as fluid as we'd like, especially having so many new players coming into the team at once, having to also learn and pick this up. So this is something I expect to improve quite dramatically in the next 2 months, maybe. In the horizontal lines, Arsenal tended to do a much better job with the horizontal lines. There were a couple of times where there were maybe 2 people, especially in the high line. But generally, the attacking kind of shape in terms of its depth, we're looking at that classic W shape where we've got 3 high, 2 underneath, or variations of that. They tended to do that pretty well. And you can see there are quite a few examples of times where, again, we were able to get that ball into the deeper line of the attacking 5, where the player was behind the opponent midfielder, and where they were able to get turned and get running at that. And there were most of the second half kind of opportunities kind of came from that situation. In the second half, what happened was Smith Rowe came off, Sambi came on, and that changed us to a 4-2-3-1. Now, while it doesn't really kind of change the shape of the attack in the sense that we're playing with we're still playing with the 2-3-5 in the attacking phase, it just gives Odegaard, who now is not playing as an 8, who is playing more as a 10, a bit more license to be a bit more central. And so what you'll find was, where he was that little bit more central, he and Aubameyang were able to stagger, and they were the only kind of 2 players through that vertical zone. And so the screen now would shift over to try to screen Odegaard from receiving the ball in behind, but would leave a passing lane open to Aubameyang. And what started to happen was you'd find Partey would have the ball, Odegaard would move inside, the defender would then come across the screen that ball into Odegaard on the angle, which allowed Partey a straighter pass into Aubameyang's feet. And that happened a couple of times where we weren't quite able to get in behind, but it was able to get us on the front foot and put their defense under pressure. And so a lot of those chances that came later on in the game came just because of that change in system. just that freedom that was given to Odegaard to be higher up the field in those areas behind their defensive line, and that in turn allowed Aubameyang to actually play higher on the shoulder of the defender. And this is something they did really well at Norwich. You know, Aubameyang countless times was on the shoulder of the defender, looking to go in behind for a more direct pass, with Odegaard playing underneath him. And I think that allowed us to kind of get a better foothold on the game in the second half, especially towards the end of the game. So looking at it, you can see JDP principles are being put in place. They haven't quite got it yet in terms of the fluidity of their movement, but then the movement keeping in line with the principles of JDP, i.e. 2 people in the vertical lines, 3 people in the horizontal lines. You can see that they are trying to be a little bit more fluid with the movement. And so that's why at times more players got caught in vertical lines, for example. And that's something that will improve, as I mentioned earlier, with a better understanding, a bit more practice, a bit more time on the field. Once we start to see that fluidity of movement, it's going to, we're going to cause problems. It's starting to happen. You can see Aubameyang at times is dropping into the left half space. And in the game against Burnley, Saka would then go towards that kind of centre forward position. At times, Saka moved a little bit too late, or Saka from the central area, or Smith Rowe from the central area. Whenever kind of Aubameyang dropped into a half space, would come and join him in the half space. And then you've also got the central midfielder with the ball in the half space. And so 3 people in the half space basically takes away passing options. Sometimes players were a little bit late to recognize it and then have someone move out of that zone into the next zone to try to keep the separation, keep the lines of passing and the angles open to help us with the passing. But it's getting there. And I think there were some real examples of when it worked, how devastating it was. Much has been said about the grass. Grass was dry, so some of those final passes, it happened quite often. I've watched the game a few times now. It happened quite often where a pass was played and then it put the receiving player under a little bit of pressure because the ball didn't have the legs to get there. I don't think it's an excuse. I do think, you've warmed up on the field, so you should recognize that the grass is a little bit dry and a little bit longer. And so you should, adjust your passes accordingly. And so that was definitely a disappointment with the forward line. Those forward players didn't really play as well as they should and were nowhere near as clinical as they should be. And that's something that they're going to have to address. I definitely think the principles are there, though. I think we're going to see some really good, exciting games because the field's going to be a lot wetter. And so the ball's going to move quicker. And, as I mentioned earlier, one of the problems that we were having was by the time the ball got into Odegaard in that left half space with Saka ahead of him, it had already been closed off and Saka couldn't receive it. If the ball moves a little bit quicker, then we can get that ball into Odegaard quicker, who can find Saka, and that will open the game up a little bit more. Generally speaking, I'm interested in seeing whether we're going to stick with the 4-3-3. Personally, I think the 4-2-3-1 works better, but it's all work in progress. I can see the improvement. I can see the system that they're looking to employ, and once they start to build some confidence in results, build some confidence in each other, build some confidence in their understanding of the rotations and movements necessary, we're going to be a force. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video. It's a longer video. Hopefully, I've explained a few of the principles that are going to be coming your way or coming our way that we're going to be able to see grow over the next couple of months. If you have any questions, please leave your questions below. You can also get me on my social media. You can find me sensible_gunner on Instagram and on Twitter. Let's have a chat about it and, engage in some conversation. If you've enjoyed this video, if you found it informational or enjoyable to watch, then please, by all means, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and share. As always, come on, you Gunners.